Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Karin Wulf, and this online event is the second in a series of John Carter Brown year-long project on history and journalism, but in particular, the second of an online event series for February, in which I have the great privilege of talking with expert journalists. We're thinking this year a lot about how history in the news, and in fact, how history is news. What happens when history in this year of the anniversary of the American Revolution is the news all the time, every day. I'll be talking with journalists and scholars, and we'll be hosting different format events all year. I'm really thrilled today to be talking with a journalist who reads and thinks and writes about history so seriously. And if you've ever felt self-conscious hosting a Zoom event, try doing it in front of an award-winning, experienced news anchor. John Dickerson is an award-winning journalist and author. He's a contributing writer for The Atlantic, and until recently, he was the co-anchor of the CBS Evening News and chief political analyst for CBS News. John led the network's election coverage and political special reports. Prior to joining CBS, John anchored the Daily Report with John Dickerson on CBS News 24/7, where for 2 years, the show created a space to go beyond the latest headlines and provide live, in-depth interviews on the day's major stories. John has also been a co-host of Slate's Political Gabfest for 20 years. He's the creator of Whistle Stop, a podcast of presidential history. And in 2024, he published an 8-essay album of personal essays. I really love this. Navel Gazing, a podcast based on the notebooks he's carried for 35 years. I'm a huge fan of this podcast and of the notebooks, a moniker he also gave to a feature for CBS. Don't worry, I'm going to ask him about notebooking today. From 2019 to 2021, John was a contributor for 60 Minutes, where his story on the death of Elijah McClain was nominated for an Emmy. John is the author of On Her Trail, a book about his mother, Nancy Dickerson, the first female correspondent at CBS News. He wrote the New York Times bestsellers Whistle Stop, got it right here, My Favorite Stories from Presidential Campaign History, and The Hardest Job in the World, The American Presidency, my copy of which seems to have gone on walkabout at home. I can only say that it must have been as intriguing to other people in my household as it was to me. He won the Ford Prize for Distinguished Reporting on the Presidency and the David Broder Award for Political Reporting. A native Washingtonian, John is a graduate of a very fine institution in my native Charlottesville, the University of Virginia. John, welcome, and thank you for being here for this conversation.
Thank you, Karin, so much for having me and for your interest in notebooks in particular, which is is a really narrow group of people, but we're a hardy bunch. And anyway, it's great to be with you.
Thank you so much. Now, another thing I know from reading you and also from listening to your podcast and from watching you on the news is that you are an incredibly skilled interviewer. So if I can do 5% as well in interviewing you, this will be a huge success. So I wanted to just start out by asking you a little bit about how history appears in your work. Like there's a way I think in which history is useful as analogy, parallel. Sometimes people talk about history as the kind of predicate for the thing that's happening now. I notice in a lot of your work, you use history as analogy or parallel. That seems like a really regular mode for you. Could you just talk a little bit about, I know you're incredibly interested in and incredibly well-versed in American political history in particular.
Well, for the bulk of my career covering politics in Washington, it was vital because we're always trying to locate and situate events in the moment, and in the Trump era, it's even more important because people talk about norms and traditions, and a lot of times you think, where are these coming from? What was the point behind them? Groundbreaking leaders break traditions and often cause a lot of stir when they do that. And to know in the moment whether the stir that they're creating is possibly consistent with American values, and therefore what they're doing is in fact sort of moving America back in concert with its original arrangement, or whether they're way out of the mainstream of American thought, not just thought in the moment. You have to go back to first principles. And that means history, and that means in the founding of the country, or the founding of the presidency, or the founding of the modern presidency, or so history is the place where you kind of find those original instructions a lot of times. And then in covering the presidency, as I have, the presidency is, not that many people have had the job. The modern presidency is an even smaller group. And it's really just the first place you kind of have to go to understand what's happening in the present. Now you have to be careful with all of that. But so my feeling has always been that there's usually something really useful about history that can either ground us in the thing we're talking about, or maybe change the lens a little bit as we're in a news environment in which there is so much news, to give our readers or viewers a new way to look at something that might kind of freshen or refresh the topic so that we're all, learning again, as opposed to kind of operating on automatic pilot.
Do you think, I'm going to give away my perspective on this immediately with the question. That's a poor interviewing skills right there. I should, but do you think that the way that you think so deeply about history, and it's not just what you said about when you're reporting on the presidency, it's that you've written about this, you've reflected on this at length in multimedia forms. Like, I was really intrigued by, for example, like the Whistle Stop podcast. You're giving a digest version of something you wrote about at length, and then I can hear or read versions of that kind of reflection in others of your work. Like, this isn't one off for you, this is a very deep in your work. Do you think that you see other journalists who work in that way, who think about historical contexts as seriously? Or do you think that this has been particular to your practice?
Oh, yeah, sure. There are lots that do. I mean, you talked to Jamel Bowie, who is a columnist now, but
Yeah.
Jamel thinks about history deeply, and I think along similar lines that I do. Peter Baker in the New York Times, of course, thinks about history a great deal. And then, of course, you now have historians who are sort of quasi-journalists in a way, or who are at least a part of the public conversation in a way. So you have it kind of going the other way. It's not just journalists who write about history, but historians who write about journalism, or commit acts of journalism. The I think we could do with a lot more of it, because one of the things that's always been a central concern of mine with journalism is, um, not just tell people what's happened, but what's happening, or not just
Mm-hmm.
say this happened today, but explain why it happened. Because there are numerous times people will, hear a headline and they'll be at dinner and they'll say, "Oh, this happened today," and the member of their family will say, "Well, why did it happen?" And they'll have no idea because the journalists who reported on the story didn't tell them. History is a great way to get at the why. And it trains you, if you're interested in history, and if you read Federalist One and the Federalist Papers, it's basically a wonderful explanation of all the possible biases, both on one side of an argument that you may support and also on the other side. And it's a little guide to the traps in, even when you're trying to be a good critical thinker. So if you're reading history, a lot of times you're picking up, or you're sharpening the skills that make for good journalism, or just make for a good critical thinker.
Do you think that's part of journalists' traditional training? Or do you think that's something that people like you, and I sort of asked Jamel this question too, but people like Jamel or Peter or other people kind of pick up along the way and think about as part of a kind of, that you have, I have discerned, I may be right or wrong, but I have discerned that for you, historical context is part of an ethical practice. But do you think that's something that has happened to you, or is that something that was,
Yeah,
sort of
it's a
baked in
great
your
question.
training?
I think I think it's something that happened to me, and I think it should be a part of our training, because what history teaches you, and especially if you hang around with historians, which I'm not within a million miles of, but you learn how rigorous they are in their craft. And and so the reason that's important is that the easy story, because we're all storytellers, but I came up in the storytelling tradition of news magazines, and there's a lot of inclination to tell good stories, um, and sometimes tell stories that are a little too good to be true. If you read Time magazine stories from the era when I was there, they would all start with this incredible lead, and it would be some moment where the candidate was doing something that then illuminated, the great wide world. And a lot of times that moment had been kind of shaped in order to make the story better, and that's of course a huge danger. Historians know how to guard against that. The best historians are the ones who can be great storytellers and stay, and deliver truth and fact. And so just being in touch with that is I think good for any of us as journalists. But because I started at Time where you had a longer lead time for your pieces, history was always a part of our thinking. And in fact, in that era, there would be, 3 or 4 time covers a year out of the 52 that would be historical. That would be,
Mm-hmm.
a new look on the founders, or,
Mm-hmm.
what happened to Freud, or, something that wasn't news of the moment, but that was historical.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I've always thought about, just kind of cliche, but journalism is about news, and news is what's new, and history is what isn't new. And that sometimes it seems like there's an inherent kind of conflict between trying to report on what's new versus what's contextual, even if what's contextual is so essential to understanding what and how something is actually new. Um, so of course, I'm a historian. I would love to pick up the New York Times and have two-thirds of my news story be like, here's the contextual background. Um, but I suspect that's not the way that editors or assigning editors actually work when they're saying you go out and do this story on whatever happened, at the El Paso airport or whatever. Um,
You've hit on the central tension, and in a newspaper or a broadcast in the evening, the clock is ticking, and so you got to say what happened. That's the first thing, and then in my view, this is not always the way it's done. Um, Spend the rest of your time trying to explain what's happening, why it's important, why I should care. Um, and I think history is like vital for that. There's and as a historian, this, but there are so many instances in which we think something is new and it's just not.
yeah.
Or if it's not new, a discussion of history helps illuminate what just happened. So this is not a super important instance of this, but it's the one that's top of mind. So Donald Trump is naming a lot of things after himself. This is a pretty rare thing for presidents to do while they're in office. The only other instance I can find is the Hoover Dam gets named for Hoover while he's still in office. So first of all, now we know something that we didn't before, which is this is super rare. It's only happened one other time while a president is in office. Hoover himself didn't name it, so that tells us something new. What's different about when a president does it versus when, in Hoover's case, it was his interior secretary? So that tells us something a little different. In Hoover's case, the interior secretary did it because Hoover's getting creamed in the election. The economy's terrible. They're trying to show a way in which he is a builder. He is getting things done in the middle of the Depression. Um, and that's interesting because there's a contemporary analog to that. Presidents, when you drive down a road that's being improved by the infrastructure act, I believe Biden's name is on the signs, but
Build Back
presidents like to
Better.
take credit for the things they're
Right.
doing. Um, and then interestingly, from there to me, and this is where it diverts because, okay, if we were talking about a news story for a day, the fact that Hoover is the only other person to have his name slapped on something while he was president, that kind of begins and ends your news story for the day. What's more interesting to me is actually, so FDR comes into office, takes Hoover's name off the dam. Harold Ickes does that, which is, we think today this idea of a presidency that undoes what the previous presidency did, and we get into this kind of ping-ponging. Well, that was going on, in 1932. So what is that? That helps us think about whether what we're going through really is a departure, or whether it represents some of the impulses behind it are constant in politics. And if they're constant, then the great thing about history is that you can then apply the lessons from the past. Because if the nature of power and ambition and ego is constant, then solutions from the past, or the way they thought about those things in the past, can in fact be ported to the present with some greater confidence that they might actually tell you something about the present. Because there's a lot of bad history where people just like tell stories and the story doesn't really affect what's going on in the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh no, exactly. I love that example of something that is new and something that isn't new, and why each one is helpful to us now in thinking about this very unusual moment we're in. I want to ask you about how you think about chronology, actually, because a thing I noticed in both of your books, in both the Whistle Stop book and the book about making the presidency, is that you bounce around in time. Like, these are not books that they don't. I mean, look, I'm not. Many historians believe that like the whole game is, change over time, and you start in a moment and you end in a moment, and I'm not one of those. But I do love it that, literally, I picked up the Whistle Stop book and I was looking for 1840 for a very particular reason that I want to tell you about after we talk about this. But I'm like, wait a minute, I have to go way past 1972 and 1988 and 1948 to get to 1840. So
Yeah.
I think I understand the logic here, but but you did the same thing in the presidency book. So
Yeah.
tell us about your sense of chronology and when it matters and when it doesn't matter.
Yeah. It's a great question because it's a possible fatal flaw. I don't think it is in those two books, but I'm up for, definitely up. It's up for debate. So in the Whistle Stop book, I basically organized the chapters by kinds of campaign behavior.
Mhm.
This was a slight marketing thing, which was essentially it was a campaign, it was a presidential year. A publisher was interested in the book, which sort of surprised me. I had been doing the podcast episodes, kind of like, oh, this interested me. 1840, the first, sort of modern presidential campaign, if you want to define it that way, which I did. And then I kind of jumped around to things that just interested me. Suddenly I'm in 1980 because Ronald Reagan's moment with the microphone in New Hampshire was, these were just kind of the kinds of conversations that happen when you're with a group of reporters who cover campaigns. People just start telling stories, and there actually is never a chronology to it. It's just, person tells the Ford eating the tamale story, and then somebody tells the Reagan story, and then it's John McCain's plane getting stuck in Seattle story, and it pinballs all over the place. And there was no through line to Whistle Stop. It was just, here are my favorite stories. And so since there was no through line, I thought it's okay to not have to do chronology. Gil Troy's See How They Ran, See How They Run, See How They Ran. I can't remember the history of presidential campaigning. It's crucial that it's chronological because, and again, this is a beautiful use of history when you go back and look at why for the vast majority of early American history, running for president was seen as completely antithetical to the job. Um, that's crucial to know that for
Yeah.
so long.
You
Um,
stand, you do not run.
that's exactly right. And, which is a really, so again, one of the wonderful ways that history illuminates our current moment. Why is that important? Well, it's important because virtue is a key part of the job. And if your ego was so large that you ran, then it would suggest you had a flaw in your virtue. And why does that matter? Because you're giving a president a great deal of power, and virtue is the guard against that. Even though the entire system was built on the idea that men were not angels, it certainly helps if they're a little closer to an angel than something else. So I think it's defensible, I think, in that way, and that's the way I did it in Whistle Stop is sort of replicate um, the way campaign stories get told by political reporters. What I in the hardest job, the conceit of the book was essentially that we don't cover presidential campaigns and presidencies based on the attributes of the office. We cover them based on a whole bunch of stuff. We cover them based on what the candidates want to talk about. We cover them based on, if you're in television, what happened in front of a camera. And all this other stuff that does nothing to tell us about whether they can handle the job. And so I tried to arrange it around what the job requires and then how we got there, and so to make thematic arguments in each individual chapter. The super big downside, possible downside that I was on the lookout for, but this is what separates sort of storytellers from historians, is that the downside is that you then start using any presidential act as evidence for whatever your argument is for that chapter. And so suddenly you're starting with Eisenhower, and then you're bouncing all the way back to John Adams. And what you're suggesting is that like presidencies are all the same, no matter what time period. And sure, they are in some large way, but you got to be super careful when you're talking, say, about decision making. Decision making in the presidency in various different times was really different. And so you just got to be careful. And I couldn't really see a way to do it chronologically that stayed. What I wanted in everybody's head all the time was we judge presidents incorrectly, both in campaigns and in the presidency, and to just kind of have that the constant message. And so I felt like doing it thematically rather than chronologically was the way to go.
Do you think, just based on that analysis in the Hardest Job book, do you think that the American public has become more, this is a historical question, has become more or less capable of seeing the presidency apart from the kind of media representation of the president?
What a great question, because, huh. I mean, obviously, for a long time, I don't know, because well, okay, I guess I will latch onto this answer. I was recently looking at a public school test from Kentucky in the beginning of the 20th century, and it was very rigorous. I mean, the historical questions on there for, I think it was eighth grade, were detailed, and it required an understanding of the Constitution and the separation of powers and how presidents got elected. So if you believe that the country had that, if this was representative, I mean, it was, Kentucky education. You got to assume that education was roughly like that in every other state, that you had a baseline knowledge of the presidency and of government that was not being interrupted by constant 24-hour news and whatever it is we have today, which takes the public away from whatever they learned in grade school. So I guess I would argue that the grade school learning was better and there were fewer distractions or at least there were fewer things to compete with that basic understanding of the way the job was supposed to be done. So I'm thinking, so I'm going to hope that maybe the presidency was more a mixture of what you read in public, but what you would have learned in school. Now, whatever you learned in school is under constant assault and barrage by, the best honed methods used to sell products. In other words, we're really on the defensive when it comes to how we think about presidents or about government or pretty much about anything, because the best minds in advertising, the sharpest PhDs in Northern California are all working to bombard us with amounts of information and kinds of information that might not exactly be, the product of reason and critical thinking, which has to compete with your ability to try to come up with a view of the presidency that's based on reason and critical thinking. So I feel like that's, I guess, where I'm going to come down on that answer, but it's a great question.
This is a related one, which is that I think something, I can't remember where I heard you say this. I believe it's in one of your reporter's notebooks segments, but you talked about journalism as kind of essential to democracy in the sense of it represents accountability and transparency. And, I believe that about scholarship too. I think that the footnote is the purest form of democratic practice because it's transparent and accountable. That's why I think scholarship for the people, is found in the footnote. Um, but, I wonder whether you think that the kind of explosion of information that we're experiencing now represents greater transparency and accountability in some ways for office holders and in politics, or less. So is transparency and accountability weighed against the sheer, what you're talking about, which is the ability of those greatest minds to sell us things. So we're getting widgets alongside political information.
Right. I think that surely there are more footnotes. There's more fact checking. There's more, and this is, the footnotes part is what's good for our business, which I say is journalism slash, history is just you have to show your work and your work has to hold
Yes.
up. And also, if you like to follow ideas, I don't know how many things in my work are the product. I used to have a good story and I can't remember what it is now. I mean, are the product of footnotes and something I learned from footnotes or books that I discovered in footnotes. Um, uh, and the number of, great books that are long out of print that, I discovered through footnotes. So that's just a brief shout out to just the community of
We love that.
knowledge.
Little
And
heart hands there for footnotes.
um, so in terms of the presidency and the public, the problem is we're just overloaded. So you have two things. You have one, nothing slows down enough for accountability to take hold. I mean, the supporters of the sitting president rioted on the Capitol for the first time since 1812, and the president in whose name they were rioting and who, um, you know, uh, actively tried to overthrow the votes of 81 million people for 2 months, in which the riot on the Capitol was just the final act. Um, how do we think about accountability in that sense? Because surely that was plenty covered,
It was
and there
transparent,
was
that's
lots.
sure.
It was
Yes.
transparent. I mean, it wasn't exactly transparent. They had to, investigators for Congress had to go get those people to talk. But the people who spoke were on the record members of the president's cabinet and members of the president's team, and both political and in office. So it was quite transparent. I mean, um, usually you have to sort of learn about the history long afterwards when, Bob Woodward writes the book or Teddy White writes the book. But we were seeing it in real time in those January 6 hearings. So the information was there. The accountability is a trickier thing.
Mm.
And I know certainly from my work, at least in television, the news cycle moves so fast and there is so much going on that accountability and questions of accountability, because they lack often the immediacy of a time element, um, get lost. So, for example, last week it was reported that the IRS turned over information about Americans that it shouldn't have. That's a big deal, huge deal. It would be, devastating to previous administrations. But on the same day, the FAA shuts down the El Paso airport because of a child's balloon. And that, if you read the New York Times story about that, just getting accountability for what the FAA said, what the Pentagon said, what the El Paso people said, what the White House said, it's a full-time job just to chase down who's telling you the truth. That's one story. You also had the Attorney General obviously testifying last week, and the ongoing situation with ICE in Minneapolis and other places. So, in this current moment, we're so inundated that the amount of information is hard to hold everyone's attention enough in order for accountability to take place, I think. I mean, or take place at the kind of level of rigor that you would want, consistent with the things that we're talking about. I mean, a major airport getting shut down for 10 days because of kind of shoddy behavior, like that's a big deal. And those other stories are obviously a big deal too, to have an attorney general who essentially acts as the president's political voice as well as his personal attorney. Like this is a massive swerve in the American system that in a kind of correct world, we'd all sit down and have a big think about whether this is really a good idea or not. But that now it's just one of, 10 stories like that a day.
Yeah. Yeah, you're exactly right. We should all sit down and have a big think. But I think what happens is we, on my side of the desk, what we hear is history will judge. And we're like, history? Wait, history isn't just some random thing that happens. It's not, on the shelf and we're going to take it off. We have to actually produce that. We need the sources for it. So we actually need access to records. We need time and space and trained people when the humanities and history in general is under a great deal of pressure. So history will judge is not really um, you know, the preferred alternative to doing the work that we need to do right in the moment.
And I also worry that, you know, part of what history does is it explains to us why you don't act now for for short-term um, benefit because of the long-term consequences. That's, one of its key jobs is to point out that, life is long and things turn around. Going back to that Hoover story, Hoover ends up getting his name taken off the dam and then put back on. Why? Because he has a
Still the
friendship
Hoover
with
Dam. Yeah.
Harry Truman of all people, right? The vice president under FDR who hated Hoover so much. So for me, that's a story about, the length of life is long. And Hoover, who was, ostracized both by the country and by FDR, suddenly he ends up basically feeding Europe after the Second World War. His reputation gets rehabilitated enough that Truman and Congress, on a rare moment of agreement, put the guy's name back on the Boulder Dam. So that just is another reminder that life is long. Well, if we all keep that in mind, then leaders don't make decisions for the moment because they know that when you say history will judge, what that means, among other things, is long-term consequences appear and they bite you in the backside. As David Blight once said, history comes back around. Stuff like so. If that's always on top of mind, then that affects your behavior. But if the whole notion of history, the whole notion of what came before is just some sort of polite behavior, not a rule of human life, then people just blow off the lessons of history and the idea that history will judge, and
Yeah.
that's incredibly dangerous in terms of constraining people's behavior who are in positions of power, and that's a real danger to not having history around to guide us, whether you're in power or not. I mean, we can talk about the personal benefits of history and the reason I think it's useful in the work that I do as a journalist, just for the layman, not if
Yeah.
you're going to be, you know, running the world.
Yeah. Absolutely. I have three things backed up on the runway here to ask you about. Speaking of airport stoppages, I want to first mention and ask you about 1840 and that first campaign. I am totally. I mean, first of all, I visited the Harrison House slash plantation on the James River for the first time earlier this year. Fascinating. But your chapter is titled "The Birth of Umbridge," which is a great title. So I want to ask you to say a few things about that first campaign. And in part, I'm amazed by that title, but also because earlier last year, an alum of Brown University um, contributed to this. So the library that I run is focuses on the early Americas, before 1800, really, but offered us, and of course we accepted, an incredible example of a log cabin from the 1840 campaign. It's remarkable. There's one at the Smithsonian, but ours is better, just say. And it's this amazing piece, of course, as you know, goes on the top of a pole that you would carry in a parade. It's a
Sure.
remarkable thing. So you'll have to come see it. But anyway, tell me about the birth of Umbridge and what that meant to write about the birth of Umbridge in 1840 campaign.
So, this is again a place where the storytelling and the history, you got to be careful. And what I was talking about is that in the modern campaign worlds, Umbridge is crucial. So, one quick example that comes to mind is Hillary Clinton talked about the basket of deplorables when she was
Mm,
talking about the various Trump supporters, and she was saying that some portion of them are deplorables. And so candidate Trump and his supporters successfully took umbrage at that comment and said, "Wait, why are you painting us all as these horrible people?" She wasn't painting everybody that way, but nevertheless, you don't say that kind of thing in a campaign because of exactly what happens. Umbrage can be used to make you look out of step and can be used to rally your supporters. So this is a pretty common thing in our modern campaigns, to take umbrage at something for the purposes of rallying your side and putting the other side on the defensive. So when I looked at the election of 1840, yeah, the log cabin campaign. The I believe it was the Baltimore newspaper ran an editorial that and it's now 10 years since I wrote that book. So Baltimore
sorry,
newspaper wrote an
it's a
editorial about
quiz.
Harrison, saying that his supporters just want to sit
Yeah,
by their log cabin and drink hard cider, I believe.
yeah,
So it
yeah.
became known as the log cabin and hard cider, or the cider and log cabin campaign, because Harrison's Whigs took umbrage at the idea that they were being characterized as these kind of bumpkins. And how dare the Van Buren forces do this, even though, and Van Buren, the other part obviously of this was that Van Buren, even though he'd grown up upstairs at his father's saloon and had not been a person of great wealth, was nevertheless, because in part of a great speech on the floor of the House, the Golden Spoon oration, which talked about how he was eating off of using utensils made of gold at the White House and spending all of this money to aggrandize himself as president, which he kind of really wasn't. Nevertheless, it was a 2-day speech, I believe, on the floor of the House about all of this largesse that Van Buren had was engaging in, and that was a problem because the Panic of 1837 had created an economic condition in the country where everybody was looking for somebody to blame. So what I don't think I got far into enough was Van Buren gets essentially blamed for the country's economic condition, but it doesn't, but blame for economic conditions of the kind of the way we think about it in modern campaigns, that wasn't exactly it, because what can a president, the expectation that a president would like fix the economy was not exactly the same as it is today. That expectation, as I write about in the book on the presidency, is out of whack anyway. But what I was focusing on is this idea of taking umbrage and using it successfully in a campaign. And in this case, it was Harrison who was the wealthy or the more wealthy of the two candidates, but somehow was the tribune of the common man. And so it was used in that way to kind of flip the biography in a way that was helpful to his campaign.
Yeah, it's so revealing that yes, the very wealthy, long lineage in wealthy Virginia planter William Henry Harrison. That's a great campaign from a historical perspective. Wouldn't have wanted to be there.
And the
But
other
yeah,
detail was that he had a spiral staircase in his house, which was apparently a super luxury item at the
very
time.
fancy, very very
Right.
fancy. Yeah, no, it's a very fancy house. Um, Okay, I want to ask you about, first of all, I want to remind folks that we'll leave maybe 15 minutes in case you have questions. You can put them in the Q&A, but I'm going to keep going here because I must ask two important questions. One, how do you decide what history to read? And do you want to tell us about something you're reading now? And also, I need to ask about the notebooking because, your journaling practice, your notebook practice, it's super great. And I love that it is a multimedia practice since you did the podcast. So those
Right.
are two. You can take them in either order.
I'm interviewing John Meacham next week at the 92nd Street Y. So I'm reading his book, um, The American Struggle, which is so that's the history I'm reading at the that's the history I'm reading at the moment. I'm also interested in Victor Hugo for the moment, so I'm reading a biography of Victor Hugo. But so that's the Meacham book is essentially, America's greatest hits documents since the before the founding. And it's why I have Federalist One on my mind, because it's in
I was going to
there.
say
And
it's not everybody's first choice of the Federalist, but
no,
okay.
but it's such a great. What also, we lost when I started covering campaigns. Candidates used to make arguments, which is to
Mm,
say they would, have a line of thinking, and they would often, in a vestigial way, do what those original writers did in the American story, which is they would say, okay, here are the principles we believe in. Those principles are linked to this good behavior. That good behavior is something I want to encourage. So I'm now, they would build an argument in almost like a geometric proof. And we just that doesn't exist anymore in politics. And I was just reminded of how much of it used to exist. Even if the goal of the person was purely ego driven or power driven, they nevertheless felt an obligation to make an argument that held together by the standards of reason. Anyway, so that's what I'm reading at the moment. What I tend to read, I go back to read The Glory and the Dream a lot, William Manchester's history from 1932 to 72. I
wow.
often think that is a good example of kind of like the story's too good to check. My guess is that there's a lot of stuff in there that Manchester just loved because it was just great, fun story. And you think, did that really happen? There's this one instance where he says, this story sounds apocryphal, but it told America something about itself, which is a great little way to get around. It may not be true, but we're gonna say it tells America something about itself, which is just fun. So, and I'm trying to decide actually, Karin, what my next sort of reading regimen is because Whistle Stop may come back to life. We've got a presidential campaign coming up, um, so I have to decide whether my last few years in television have been very different than when I was covering politics. So my history reading was somewhat diminished and also less sharp in terms of um, specifically devoted to the challenges and questions of the day.
Mm.
Did that answer part of the question? But
Sort of, but I'm completely fascinated with what's going to happen when you make that choice and what you start reading. Totally interesting. I wonder, like, if I can ask a follow up there, what's the most unexpected thing you've read that's historical in the last, pick a chronology. But what surprised you, or did you think, like, I wouldn't have read that, or I, didn't mean to read that, or I tripped across this thing, or
let's see. I don't. There's definitely an example. I'm just. Well, actually, I mean, this is cheap, but the Hoover Dam thing surprised me because I
yeah.
thought, wait, what? Who I like the Hoover Truman actually I'll use this example. The Hoover Truman relationship, I didn't I mean, I knew because I have both of them. Hoover's reports on the presidency. Because when I wrote my book about the presidency, I was interested in all of the presidents who tried to reform the office. And
Mm,
so I thought, that's crazy. Like Hoover did two reports for Truman on improving the presidency, which play a role in expanding the imperial presidency. I guess what I just didn't realize is the way in which Hoover, which comes across in these letters he wrote to Truman, sort of felt personally touched by
mm,
Truman kind of opening the door back up to public service. I also read recently Nixon's private letter he wrote to the family
mm,
of the young man, one of the young men killed at Kent State. He
mm.
called them bums, the protesters at
Yeah.
Kent State. But then he wrote a private letter to the family, which is a little weird. The letter itself is a little weird, but the sentiment is totally at odds with the public persona. And I thought, huh, Um, what does that tell us about Nixon? What does that tell us about did he feel an obligation as a president to weigh in or just as a father
Mm,
to send a note? I didn't know he'd written that. I knew about what he'd said publicly, but I didn't know he'd written that. So I guess
mm.
that's another thing that surprised me. I'll probably come up with another one while we're talking.
Well, it's interesting because obviously, you're a person who reads and thinks and writes about the American presidency and American political campaigns, particularly presidential campaigns. And you write about the 19th century and really focus on the 20th century. But I'm wondering if I can ask you about the semi-quincentennial and the 250th, because I'm an 18th century historian. I think it's all about the 18th century. All of that later stuff is fine and interesting, but it all proceeds from. And the thing
Right.
it proceeds from, we need to really understand really well. Anyway, I wonder if you have any thoughts about how kind of either, because our project is about helping journalists think about the semi-quincentennial and helping journalists report on um, kind of the revolution as news. So I
Uh,
wonder, you have any thoughts about that?
yeah, I have thoughts. I mean, I think that so, the founders and American thinkers from that period, we have to be careful, not to valorize them, not to put them on pedestals. On the other hand, they spent a lot of time thinking about how you build a government that works for a sprawling, getting bigger country. They
Mm,
thought a lot about history and the lessons of history. They thought a lot about personal psychology. And I mean, I think there's no, and I mean, you read Washington's farewell address about what would happen, the danger of faction. And I mean, it sounds like you're reading political analysis from yesterday.
mhm,
And so the reason I think that's so important, and I've now moved on to make a second point, but I want to go back to the first one in a moment. But when something is so spot on to what's happening in the present, then you might think, well, maybe they had other things that were true that we've lost that maybe we should try and get back to. Because if they were
mm,
so right about human nature and the nature of
mm,
power and the nature of the way people gather around power and the sides they would take and the various different roles people would play, if they could see that so clearly 250 years
mm,
ago, then maybe as we all feel we're a little off the beam, we might look back to some of their ideas to get back on the beam.
mm,
Or if we recognize the value of what they're saying, we'll be a little bit more prompted to behave in a way that's consistent with some of those original thoughts, as opposed to just thinking like, oh, those are just old thoughts and aren't they pretty? And their sentences run backwards and they wrote with a quill pen. Um, so so that's but I think that the previous point I was making about the fact that they thought so much about governments and history is that they just put in the hours thinking about, well, what does power do to a person? And what have we seen that do to rulers throughout history? And how do we divide power up so that we don't, when they, in reading Balin's ideological origins of the American Revolution, the cancer the power is described as a cancer, or
mm.
as like the tides of an ocean, like just this
Yeah.
overwhelming force that no matter how virtuous you are, power is going to make you abuse it. And
Mm,
so now you understand, okay, when we say that Congress, the majority in Congress is totally ineffective, you can just say that and stop and go on to the next story, or you can think, well, wait, this is about a system that was built like a clock, and all of the springs had, or not the springs, but the individual sprockets had to mesh and work together. And if one of them doesn't work,
mm,
the system doesn't work. And what does that mean? Well, now we go back to power. What it
mm,
means is that this force, this unquenchable thing, is going to ruin the American system. So now the stakes are pretty high. And the people who gave us the map for understanding that were writing 250 years ago. Um,
yeah.
and so and they were writing about it in a way that nobody writes about it today, or if it gets written about today, it just gets overwhelmed. So you can use the moment of national celebration to pay attention to some of the thinking that went on. And I mean, Benjamin Franklin at the end of the Constitutional Convention is the best. Everybody should have to read that every morning before they read the news and seek to dismiss the opinions of others. So
Mm.
there's just a lot of good sort of critical thinking hygiene that came from some of that period as well.
Do you think there are useful analogies there too in the way that we think about, for example, critiques um, of an extraordinary power? I mean, their critique obviously is of inherited power in the monarchy, although they're critiquing Parliament too. They're pretty mad at Parliament,
Yeah,
but but obviously we have a lot of critiques now of extraordinary wealth, and the exercise of extraordinary wealth that people think is illegitimate power, basically, because that's their ultimate critique: is it's illegitimate power.
right.
Um, so, do those analogies work? I'm going to remind people too that you can put Q&A in the chat, and I will ask John. I promise I'll get to it in just a minute.
Um, I think, yeah, I think it's the the idea that power concentrated in any form, whether it's in a king or in the merchant class or in Madison was not so happy about the people.
Mm,
I mean, so the idea, because there's a lot of well, the country, some portion of the country thinks this. One of the things you learn from history is that there were presidents and thinkers in political life who were like, you know what, the country is totally wrong. You can't say that anymore because of the way the elections work, and nobody's allowed to say that. And certainly, if you're in certain media organizations, you have to kind of bend over backwards to, in a weird way, overvalue what people think, even if you know in your heart of hearts that what they think is wrong. Which isn't to say that you have the better answer, but you definitely know their view of something is incorrect. But that's not
mm,
you're not allowed to say that out loud. And so which has a distorting effect on things. But the way in which the framers and the founders and people thought about concentrations of power and the warping nature of that on individuals and in groups is, quite important. I guess what I worry about is, or not worry about, I just wonder about is how that then, what's the next beat? So, for example, when everybody was printing Hamilton's views about what happens if a demagogue becomes president, everybody got the historical connection. And
mm,
so one of the things I wonder about um, looking back 250 years is kind of how much people will make the linkage and how much it won't get just relegated to being sort of a pleasant story about the past.
Yeah, well, I mean, honestly, I think this is the central question, because that past is so complicated, because Washington is a man who recognizes the dangers of extreme power, but he also exercises extreme power as an enslaver. So he's
Yeah.
like,
Oh,
he
sure.
is a man who, and most of, a lot of them do. So there is this, so it's almost like it's, I find it extraordinarily, to use your word, hygienic to think about the historical context. Imperfect people, actually sometimes more than imperfect or less than imperfect, I don't know which way we're going there, who nonetheless articulated some really valuable principles, ideas, and structures that we could build on.
Right.
um, and it's
If
like that feels to me really hygienic, the whole,
Yeah.
having the whole of it.
I Frederick Douglass can call, the Declaration of Independence a glorious liberty document.
Mhm.
I
Yeah,
mean, with the embedded, obvious hypocrisy of
yeah,
slave owners writing about freedom to all men.
yeah,
If those ideas can live long, can be durable enough to survive that hypocrisy and be used by Frederick Douglass
yeah.
to give himself sustenance after the Dred Scott decision, in which, can you imagine? This is what I was talking about, the kind of self-help way in which history can sometimes work. After Dred Scott, when the Supreme Court of the United States decides about the worth of it, and I guess I hadn't read until Meacham's book what Taney actually, I'm sure I read it, but I guess
Oh,
I forgot what
Roger
Taney
Taney,
actually
what a
wrote.
guy. Yeah, yeah.
the Supreme Court of the United States saying that, and that is now the law of the land. Like you would
Mhm.
there what more depressing news could there be? And Douglas responds like, nope, I have hope in these
Yeah.
values and these
Straight ahead.
beliefs which come
Yeah.
out of the document written by those slaveholders.
Yeah.
And that sustains him and so many others. I don't know if Jamel talked about this when you talked to him, but I moderated a panel that he was on before the election about hope.
Yeah.
And his argument for where he finds hope in history is he said the abolitionists um, at certain periods had absolutely no reason to think that slavery was going away. In fact, the tide was going in the other direction, and yet they kept with their values and
Basic.
beliefs.
Yeah.
There was absolutely no reason for hope, but they maintained it because of the strength of their belief in America and human nature, and retaining that hope for people who feel hopeless. Um,
Yeah.
the example of those who were able to be hopeful in moments of despair is a good thing to be reminded of when we're thinking about that incredibly imperfect nation and imperfect history.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Let me ask you, I've got two questions here, so I want to make sure I get to this. Um, okay. Oh, so I'm going to go to got two questions. We're going to try to get to both of them, even though we have a few minutes here. So one is actually a question that I'm going to distort a little bit to make it fit this kind of history and journalism frame, which is, and the question is about how do you confront people that you're interviewing when they are untruthful to you, when they're just lying to you as a journalist? How do you handle that? And there's an analogous situation as a historian when you know that the source is fully misrepresentative of what has happened in the past.
Right.
And how do you get around that? Like, how do you think about what's happening in that moment?
Yeah, I was uh, not to go, Mike. I'm milking this Hoover Dam and story more than I should, but Harold
It's a
Ickes
really good
says
story. Very interesting.
Harold Ickes says Herbert Hoover had nothing to do with the Hoover Dam. I'm like, what? Is that right? Not only did Hoover have something to do with it in his own presidency, he, as Commerce Secretary, negotiated the deal over the water rights for the Colorado River that ended up starting and allowing for the Hoover Dam. So he worked
Yeah.
on it in two administrations. Anyway, it's just when you said, sources that lie. I mean, that's a Trump level lie that Hoover had no relationship with it. So it reminds you that in the past, people in power told straight up lies, with great skill. And that isn't to say that some other thing you might read about FDR that Harold Ickes wrote in a letter or was a primary source material might be actually 100% accurate. So again, why I have such reverence for historians, because historians are always having to think, is this accurate? Who's my narrator, essentially, to think of it in English literature terms? What's the context of this? One of my biggest problems is always like, oh, this means this. And I'm like, no, actually, in the time, it meant the entirely opposite of what you mean. And that's why history has always, been so appealing as a journalist, because you have to have all these habits of mind that are, including, as you said, but always thinking about where the information is coming from, especially when it confirms your previous thinking. On
Mm.
interviews, so the biggest problem with interviews with people who aren't telling the truth, and this has gotten acutely problematic during the Trump era, which I knew in 2015 when I became the host of Face the Nation, but it's now everybody knows it. But at the time, I did an interview with Glenn Thrush, who was at Politico,
Mhm.
and I said, the president, candidate Trump, will say something he knows is not true. He knows is not true because he'll be happy to have a fight for 10 minutes about what he said that isn't true. Because for 10 minutes, people will think, well, maybe it is true. Or just for 10 minutes, we're talking about immigration, which is an issue he wants to talk about, rather than education or healthcare or income inequality or whatever else, which wouldn't be an issue that he had either anything to say about or that would be just a generally good issue. A lot of campaigning is about owning the turf of the conversation.
Mm.
So even if you're being fact checked on the turf that's your turf, it's better for you than being on some other turf. Definitely if the turf is being decided by an interviewer who's going to ask you questions that are difficult. So purposely saying something untrue for the purpose of owning the territory, it was evident then, and it's now something we live with all day long. And there's no downside. In fact, as we saw from the Attorney General testifying before the House, there is an upside for certain members of the administration to say things that are inconsistent with the standards of their office and standards of public life. So, how do you deal with that in an interview context, especially when the clock is ticking? If you've got
Mm,
6 minutes to talk, and I've given slightly long answers here, you know what it's like because okay, now I've got a minute left and I have 10 other questions to ask. And there are five follow-ups I should ask to the answer they just gave. So I mean, we're going to have to come up with with a way to do it in real time. I mean, I have suggested, no one took me up on it at my previous network, that there be ways that you can in real time, um,
yes.
online and other places give contextual backup
Footnotes.
for what the person's saying. Um, anyway, it's brutal in the public interview with people who are not acting in good faith. Um, is a waste of time almost because the reason it's not a total waste of time is viewers are quite smart and they just don't know what to do with this knowledge a lot of times, but they're quite smart. They can see when somebody's not answering a question. That's one of the
Yeah.
wonderful ways in which viewers and readers get it. They totally know when somebody's giving an answer that's unsatisfying or when they're ignoring it altogether. The problem is the political system is in a state where they feel like, okay, I'm just frustrated by that. I don't know how
Yeah.
to turn that into um, something useful. The best method, though, if you've got to do any of this, is just get people to explain the why. So you believe that, okay? Why do you believe that? And if somebody's just acting in bad faith, it's usually hard for them to answer to give the reasons for why they think what they think. It's usually just dogma, and nobody
Hmm.
does a lot of thinking about dogma.
Hmm.
But it's not so easy.
That's a fact. All right, I want to ask one last question from my friend Rick Ring here, which I think is a really good one. I love this, and I think it's a question that is appealing to both you and I, John. It says, "What is the highest form of critical thinking hygiene?" That's in air quotes, that a journalist can offer.
Well, I think so. That I think there's the inside game and the outside game. So I think we model, or we should model critical thinking um, in the work that we do. In other words, that we should model the fact that not all information is perfect. Certain views, even by people who are area experts, are provisional.
Mm,
The problem with this is then you get back to, the very nature of knowledge is unknowable. You don't want to go too far, but you want to convey that in the telling of the story, you have thought through, and this is why I get going back to Federalist One, is that basically what Hamilton is saying is like, I've thought through all the reasons that you may be against me and I may be behaving, exhibiting confirmation bias and some of these other biases. Like, in other words, it's the purchase price of trying to get somebody to listen to him is like, I've thought this through. I understand. And I'm not saying you're crazy if you disagree with me, because sometimes people in the right are nevertheless wrong because of their biases. And sometimes people who are awful are nevertheless right because the facts of the case are supporting them. Like, so I think you want to try as best as possible to demonstrate all of that in the way you do your work.
mm,
And that can sometimes be just showing your work. In other words, showing doing the interviews. The problem, again, you run into time, people's attention, whatever venue you're in might not have the time for it. But I think you want to model externally the habits of critical thinking, which is that you recognize that you have your own biases. You recognize that stories usually operate on a continuum. Some are much closer to one end than the other, but that they aren't one or the other, and each side is not equally weighted. But to recognize that on any given question, the debate is taking place usually along a continuum. Again, it might be very close to the one end, but you want to not promote the idea that there's just a binary view of the world.
mm,
Internally, you want to do, and I'm going to say something that might freak out lots of people who don't like artificial intelligence, but you want to basically what editors used to do is they would beat the dickens out of your writing, to make sure that you were not making any logic leaps, that you were citing good sources, that you had two sources for something instead of one. The editors are, they just aren't around much anymore. I mean, in other words, just the entire news business
Yeah.
has shrunk.
Yeah.
You can prompt AI when you write something to say, make sure every assertion here has a factual basis.
Mm,
Um, what would the most incisive critic from the left and the right say about this?
mm,
Which of these following biases, which I'm known to engage in, might be in evidence here?
mm,
And you can basically create a prompt that toughens up your stress tests, the work that you do.
mm.
Um, and I've found that to be, especially since I operate often, um, I mean, all those essays I wrote, I was the writer and the editor. So, um,
Hard to edit
you,
yourself. Yeah.
yeah, and that's impossible to do when you're writing because you're in love with what you've written.
Yeah.
Um,
You're so
so I
persuasive
think,
to yourself.
yeah, internally you have to find ways. I mean, AI is one useful way, but other find ways to kind of, just basically keep testing what you're doing and making sure that you're being fair, not to, in a political sense, but fair to you're apportioning the evidence to the claim.
Mm,
You're not overtelling a story. You're delivering it whole, as Matthew Arnold, I think it was used to say. And like sometimes that means having a list on your desk, or in my case, so that you don't,
yeah.
in the gallop of writing, forget to sort of check yourself and make sure that you're not the a lot of the problem with the press is usually we like a good story more than like it's ideological.
Mm.
That can get you into trouble, which is where it usually gets me into trouble with history because, you know, uh, I like a good story.
That is a really perfect way to end. In addition to the yay footnotes call out there, which is, I've already put an asterisk in my notes here. John, thank you so, so much for this conversation. I appreciate it so much. I hope you'll come to the library to see the log cabin. Um, and I look forward to more conversation as you're available.
Well, thank you so much. This was a delight. I can't think of a better way to end a Friday afternoon. And I look very much forward to coming up and seeing the library and meeting you in person. Since I'm lucky enough to go to Providence and Brown now and again. So
Excellent.
thank you so much. I really, really had fun.
Thank you so much. All right. Take care. Have a great weekend.